right. Hello, everybody, and welcome to EarthShift Global's April Brown Bag webinar. My name is Laura Maynilla, and I am very excited today to have three of our analysts presenting. I'd like to welcome our Senior Sustainability Analyst, Mariana Ortega, as well as our Sustainability Analysts, Joao Bonales and César Camou. All three of our analysts presented at the CILCA conference in Mexico City last week. Will be sharing insights from their presentations with us today. All right, César will be kicking things off today. César, please take it away.
Thank you, Laura, and thank you to the audience for your time today. We are very excited to present the results. So we have different topics. The idea is that we talk for a few minutes about each topic, and the first one I'm very excited to share with you because it's a project that we already worked during the last few months around the understanding of environmental impacts of the MaterPD software. MaterPD is a new software that was developed by EarthShift Global, and we are very excited to share these insights with you. In the next slide, please, Laura. I want to share two key messages with you around this topic and this sector, that is the software, because it is very, very difficult to address the modeling of this kind of products that we call software. The first message is that the software is the most significant yet least recognized source of environmental impacts. And that means that we understand, that we know with our team, with Ismael Velasco, that already work in this project as well, that software can lead to drastic changes in environmental impacts of the system, considering all the hardware and all the software decisions for the use of resources and energy. And the second one is that the LCA community can make a significant difference around this sector. We need to do more work on this, and in the next slide you will see why is this important. In this slide, we try to address, or at least recognize, the main drivers of the software environmental impacts, at least the things that we believe that will lead this contribution to the impacts. In one section of the funnel, the supply funnel, we need to consider for the software the consumption of resources and energy in the data centers and networks. That means that we need to account for every equipment, every computer, every server that is functioning in a data center for the operation of this data center, and provide resources for third parties like this software as a service, like MaterPD. We need resources from a data center to operate the software, and then this software is presented or is used in the other side of the software dial, the demand funnel. That means that the consumer start their computer, their consumer electronic, and then start using the software as a service. That means that we need to account as well for all the production, distribution, and extraction of the software in this consumer electronics. So we have two phases to address the impacts, and in the next slide, you will see that if you research a little bit around life cycle assessment of this sector, of this topic of software, you will see that there is a little bit of research only. If you focus, for example, on electronics, it's easy because we already have databases, we already have other projects and companies working on life cycle assessments around electronics, but not too much people working on the software side of the things. In the next slide, please, Laura. We have the goal and scope of this project, trying to address this software impacts, and we decide to use this functional unit, the annual operation of the software. And we mean scalable software because, as you will see in the results, we consider something very, very interesting as a scenario, that is the use of serverless resources. That means that when the software have one customer using the app, then we ask for the data center for resources. But when we don't have any client operating the software at the moment, then we don't ask for resources for the data center. That means that it's like a switch on, switch off of the resources, and we can decrease in that way the consumption of energy and resources from that. This functional unit is focused in a software dedicated to the building of LCA models like MaterPD, using some specific units of the data center with a power usage effectiveness of 1.12. This number is related with the extra energy needed to address or to maintain the server operating from the data center. So with this in mind, we create 3 scenarios to analyze what happens with software decisions. If you decide to create your software, for example, in a data center and a specific location for the data center, if the resources of your software allow you to use a specific processor technology, and if the server solution really helps with the reduction of resources and environmental impacts. So the overall performance is analyzed after that. In the next slide, we have the system boundaries. When we start addressing this model, we see that if we need to understand the environmental impacts of a software solution, we need to create almost 11 functional units. But that is if you want to look at the big picture, and that is very difficult. But if we focus on what happens with the things that you can control, that the software can control, then you can see 3 processes in yellow that are the processes that you can control with the software. The first one is a virtual server, the capacity of the virtual server, the capacity of the database, and the capacity of the storage space. That means that with these 2 processes, you can understand how the software can change or drive the energy and resources consumption of a data center. In this case, in this project, or at least for this presentation, we focus only on the data center side. In the next slide, we will start looking at the, we use this method. We will look at the results with the ES+ method. That is a method that EarthShift Global use as an overview of the environmental impacts. And let's see the first result in the next slide, please, Laura. The first one is what happens if you decide to change the location of your data center. In this case, for MaterPD, we have we will allocate the resources for MaterPD in Sweden. And that is interesting because if you compare the consumption of electricity, you will see that it's drastically different between different locations. Those are real locations of data centers. And in this case, we see that for Sweden, is a very helpful decision. Your software can use different resources depending on the data center that you use. In the next slide, for example, we have the processor technology of the virtual server. In this case, we have the first one is Graviton2 processor or IC that is related with more efficiency of processing resources. In the second case, we have the Intel Xeon processor that is related with an older technology, not too older, but we refer to more than 5 years. And this decision is related with the fact that in your software, you will decide when you, for example, perform a calculation, how much resources do you need from the data center, from the virtual server? You need resources to create that calculation. And the time that the data center spend doing the calculation and the conditions that your algorithm that you create in your software needs to address can make a difference in the resources efficiency. That's why the decision of a processor can have a significant difference in the environmental impact because can processing different amounts of resources and in different times. In the next slide, we see another comparative results considering the serverless solution. I already explained this serverless solution, and it's related with the fact that you can switch on and switch off the resources that you need. That's why we say we are building a scalable software as a service. That means that if we have one user, we ask for the data center for the resources for one user. If we have 1,000 users, if we have 100, depending on the number of the users of the software, is the amount of resources that the software asks to the data center to use. That resources of the virtual server, of the database, and the storage space to operate the calculation, in this case, of the LCA models. So if we integrate these three comparative results in the next slide, we will see the integrated results. What happens if you start looking at the software design decisions in the early stage of your product, and what happens if you don't look that? This is a simple model and a preliminary model that we're building to understand better the environmental impacts of MaturPD and other related software as a service models. But the first thing and the interesting thing that we find in this project is that you can decrease up to 97% the environmental impacts, in this case in climate change category, only by deciding these three things. This is difficult because you need to look for how to address these things and how to allocate these resources for your software and use it in a better way that you can address this processor technology, this location of the data center, and this way to operate your software as a serverless solution. In the next slide, I summarize the main insights from this project. The first one is that you can really decrease significantly the environmental impacts of your software at the early stage during the design decisions. The second one is that we need to look more for the software design, because we have preliminary results that this can influence the resource usage of the end user device, that be the computer of the user, because we can look at reduce the use 10%, 20% of the resources during the operation of the app in the end user device, and that can drastically reduce the resource consumption as well. The third one, and one of the most important for me, is that this study demonstrates the significance of the needed of operate software, and specifically software as a service as a functional unit. We can address these models with software as a service with this functional unit. And finally, and not least important, is that focusing on software eco-design in early stage can make a great difference in reducing environmental impacts. That is why MaturPD is designed about, that you can address in the early stages of the design of your products, your technologies. You can use MaturPD to understand better how some decisions can reduce the environmental impacts in the early stages. That is the thank you. In the next slide, we have some references, and this is the project that we present at CILCA last week. And now it's time to another interesting topic with Mariana Ortega around other great topic to discuss. Thank you.
Thanks, César, and thanks, Laura. Yeah, Mariana Ortega, based in Mexico, analyst here at EarthShift as well. In my talk at CILCA last week, one of the talks was this: Sustainable and Fair Transitions in Agriculture, the case of native corn in Mexico. And before moving on to the official introductory slide, I want to tell you a little bit of the context of why this topic. For the last 6 years, I have been collaborating with different civil society organizations. I didn't turn on my video. And we are concerned with the quality of food that we eat in Mexico and how that food is produced. And corn is at the center of this concern because we eat corn in tortillas and other foods as well, but we eat tortillas, most of us Mexicans, I would dare say, during breakfast, lunch, and dinner. And depending on how tortillas are made, they can be either more or less nutritious. And depending on how corn is grown, it can foster more or less protection to soils and biodiversity. And these two things are dear to me and other persons that I collaborate with in these organizations, including Malin or Emilia and Gemma and Amalia are LCA analysts as well, Amalia here in EarthShift. And we are collaborating in doing this research. So the next one, please. Thank you, Laura. The idea of changing how corn is grown to make it be regenerative corn as much as possible brings me to the topic of how transitions occur. According to some theories, we can consider innovation as being part of small niches that are at the bottom of this figure, occurring in the whole system. So niches at the bottom that when they grow and come together, become larger, then they can become part of regimes in some location in a country. And then taking the opportunity, windows of opportunity, they may become a part of the landscape and be the norm, become the norm. Now, there are already many regenerative farmers, corn farmers, and for other foods that we work with. But I want to talk to you in this case about a specific old innovation that we have for corn production in Mexico. Can we go to the next one, please, Laura? And that is the agroecological milpa. Milpa means or is a polyculture where corn is not grown alone, different to the monoculture system that you see in the picture on the right. So milpa is a polyculture. It means several crops are growing together and they have this symbiotic practice in growing together. So, for example, the three main ones that participate in a milpa would be corn, beans, and zucchini. And so the corn provides the support for the bean to grow on it, and also support a little bit for the zucchini. But the bean will take nitrogen from the air, as you may know, and share it with the other crops. And then the zucchini will provide shade to both and thus will conserve more water in the soil for their consumption. So in general, this was the way old Mexican farmers used to grow corn. And this was way before the Green Revolution occurred around the 1950s, and we started growing corn more in monoculture, and then losing many of the native varieties that we had in the past. We still have a very big biodiversity in terms of variety of native corns, but it's decreasing. It is decreasing. It has been decreasing a lot. This variety in corn is related to the variety of milpas that we have in Mexico, because native corn and milpas have been adapting to different types of weather and soil conditions that we have in the country. And so maintaining these varieties and this diversity in our corn is important because it is a sort of insurance against climate change for our food security. And this is something that we don't have with the monoculture system. And so there it is our interest in mine specifically in building environmental indicators that make good comparisons between one system and the other. So the objective of this work is to develop environmental indicators that compare the milpa way versus the conventional way of growing corn in Mexico. If we go to the next one. Thank you, Laura. So the methodology and analytical approach for this. We use LCA to do the comparative analysis of conventional non-irrigated and rain-fed production of corn versus the milpa polyculture. We took a functional unit of 1 kilogram of grain and use the data sets from the workbook database because it has regionalized data sets available for Mexico for corn and their irrigated and non-irrigated production. And so we took the conventional non-irrigated data set and modified it to represent milpa production. Milpa yields were taken from a research from EVEL in 2017. Now, after that, we used the results from the LCA and did a little bit of material flow accounting considering national scenarios. What would happen if to the emissions if conventional non-irrigated milpa, conventional non-irrigated corn production shifts to be 100% milpa polyculture. And lastly, I won't show you much of the results around backcasting, but backcasting is related to positioning ourselves in the desired future and thinking back. What needs to happen to get us to the desired future? And so for the last years, we have been doing workshops and interviews with stakeholders in the sector, thinking of ways that we could make this happen. And I'll tell you a little bit about that later. If we go to the next slide, please, Laura. So results from the life cycle assessment, and I must say this is just a scoping study. We take it very seriously that we don't publish screening results. This is not a full LCA, nor is taking much primary data into account. So these are just results to give us an idea, our group, of what could happen, what may be interested to research more. So results that we get are, the milpa system seems to reduce significantly the impacts in all categories in comparison to the non-irrigated and the irrigated conventional way of growing corn in Mexico. And in general, I'm not going to go into the details, but in general, this is due to the higher yields that could be obtained in the milpa system, and also because of the allocation of impact between the corn and the other crops. We consider beans, zucchini, and milpa just for this exercise, but there can be many more. So that's the first take on the results. If we go to the next one, because I'm running out of time. In this one, we see a little bit of the MFA results. The aqua color on the top represents the irrigated corn production. So you see that this is grown in 2.2 million hectares in Mexico. And then the non-irrigated corn is grown in almost more than double of that surface, 5 million tons, about 5 million tons. And you see the yields that we are considering in each one. So the milpa is something between the non-irrigated and the irrigated ways. And if we consider the transition of 100% non-irrigated corn to the milpa polyculture in Mexico, we get a reduction in emissions from 7.4 million tons of CO2 equivalents to 4.5. And in terms of production, we go from 15 million tons of corn produced to 22 million tons produced. These are scoping indicators, but still they are very interesting when we think about what could happen at national level. Now, this doesn't take into account potential carbon uptakes by the soil when agroecological practices that are occurring in milpa polyculture take place. So that could be an additional improving from insetting. Yeah, if we go to the next one, please. Thank you, Laura. We have this vision in the grassroots movement that I work with that is called the Alliance for Our Tortilla. In our vision, the Mexican society has reclaimed good tortilla, the ideal tortilla that is nixtamalized. I didn't go into that, but it's the way that tortillas become more nutritious. And they are made from native corn. They are free from agrotoxics and GMOs and additives. And this has to do with the milpa way of producing. So for the backcasting, we take into account the context because that's very important in terms of taking advantage of the windows of opportunity to move from the regimes to the landscape. And in terms of growing from niches to regimes, I tend to offer all of these industrial ecology approaches, so toolboxes to take those indicators from impact measurement, that indicator set that can include life cycle indicators, to something more for communication that is connected to ecolinguistic, to social norms, and to the theories on the behavioral economics theory, and the whole supply chain. So yeah, this just to say that we are looking into all of these things while working as a group. I think I'm running out of time, but just if we go to the next one, please. Laura, thank you. I also want to share that at CILCA, we also presented a case study on a handprint assessment. And for those of you that may not be familiar with this, handprints are about measuring the positive impacts towards sustainability instead of measuring the footprint. If we go to the next one. So just to say, yeah, handprint means commitment to achieve environmental sustainability, leadership, and all these things. And the analytical approach that we at EarthShift use for calculating handprints is rooted in the sustainable return of investment method. If we go to the next one. So this is a methodology that was developed out of the AICI total cost assessment methodology. It addresses the inherent uncertainty in investments and difficult stuff to calculate around projects that want to know what their handprint is. It uses a multi-stakeholder approach where we get together with the stakeholders and ask what is important, what is concerning. And then based on the topics that they are interested in, we build a set of indicators and turn them into, if possible, money value, to be able to make comparisons between the indicators and see how much of what we are studying is good in comparison to other potential goods and also risks, opportunities and risks. So yeah, I just wanted to share that we also presented on that, but we don't have enough time to present the whole case study here. So I think this is the last one. Yeah, thank you. And I'll pass it now to Joel.
Thank you, Mariana. Thank you, everyone, for attending in the public. My name is Joel Bonales. I'm a sustainability analyst at EarthShift Global, and I'll present to you some of our insights in a comparison of agricultural inventory modeling for two LCA databases, in which we used two case studies, coconut and soybean, for the ecoinvent and Agrifootprint databases. Next one, please. So as an introduction, and coming from the LCA sector, we are aware that in order to put together the models for our systems, we need both foreground and background data. The foreground data is the mostly primary data that we will gather specifically for the project, while the background data comes directly from LCA databases. And so one question that all LCA practitioners have asked themselves in a moment of a given project is, okay, I have two similar data sets. Which one should I use? So this question will have important effects and ramifications over what will the LCA model be built upon and the insights and findings that can come from these results. And this is especially important for those products that are derived from agricultural crops. Down below, we have an example of a fictional oil in which we can see that the main hotspot for the impacts lies at the upstream agricultural cultivation stage. And so this gives us a glimpse of the importance that how does this agricultural cultivation stage is being modeled will have when we are looking at the contribution analysis from our final products, or most important, when we are comparing or benchmarking to other products from the sector or from other databases. Next one, please. So keeping this in mind, the objective of this project was to run a comparison for the potential environmental impacts, mostly derived or focusing on the direct field emissions. I'll talk about this in a minute, as calculated by two different commercial LCA databases, ecoinvent and Agrifootprint. And for this, we chose two different case studies, soybean production in Argentina and coconut production in the Philippines. Next one, please. So the methodology for this project was divided in three parts. The first one was to do an analysis of the main formulas for the methods, in which we gather information from the documentation for both the ecoinvent and Agrifootprint databases. And in this part, I think it is important to define what we are referring to as direct field emissions. So these direct field emissions are those emissions to the air, water, and soil compartments that are caused by the reaction of external inputs, let's say synthetic fertilizers, manure, pesticides, etc., and the soils in which these crops are being cultivated. And then, moving back to the main method of this project, we compare the inventories for these two versions of the same crop within the same country. So we compare the soybean from Argentina in ecoinvent and Agrifootprint, and the coconut from the Philippines in ecoinvent and Agrifootprint. And we focused on a certain direct field emissions because, well, as you may all be aware of, this list can be almost hundreds of substances, because we will have also toxic emissions, heavy metal emissions, and different nitrogen and phosphorus-based emissions. But right now, this project focused on carbon dioxide, methane, nitrous oxide, ammonia, and nitrogen oxides emissions to air, and nitrates, phosphates, and elementary phosphorus emissions to water. Then, after this inventory comparison, we ran the comparison of the environmental impacts in the CIMAPRO LCA software. We chose the Recipe 2016 impact methodology because of its widespread use for LCA worldwide, and specifically in agricultural products. And then we will focus on six key impact categories for which the direct field emissions often prove to be a hotspot for impacts: global warming, acidification, freshwater and marine eutrophication, land use, and water consumption. Next one, please. So as the first part of our method, we took a deep dive into the documentation for each one of these databases, and we found that for Nearly all of the field emissions of interest of this project, the methods for calculating those emissions are the same regardless of the database. But we found that in the specific case of emissions to water, in this case, the nitrate and the phosphorus, the methods are different. So we'll have the sustainability check for biofuels for calculating nitrate emissions to water in ecoinvent, and the CILCA model for calculating phosphorus emissions to water on ecoinvent, while in Agrifootprint, we'll use a variation of the Tier 1 formulas from the IPCC for nitrate and a given emission factor of 0.1 kilogram of phosphor per phosphorus input of manure and synthetic fertilizer from the same recipe method. Next one, please. And so we also consider it was important to do a quick comparison on what type of agricultural parameters both databases are considering. We are showing here the parameters for the cultivation of soybean in Argentina. We can see that the yield is slightly different, slightly lower in the case of ecoinvent, and well, the data sources are similar, but different years are being considered on this temporal horizon for defining or calculating the average yield. And we can also find some important differences when we move to the synthetic fertilizer input, especially in the case of nitrogen, for which in the case of the ecoinvent database, it is 57% lower. And this is also related to the different sources that each database will have on how to calculate or how to define the specific synthetic fertilizer intake for each case. Next one, please. Then moving into the inventory comparison, we are right now focusing on those important cases in which we found significant differences. The first one, the ammonia emissions to air, isn't as the difference isn't as wide, so the emissions are fairly similar, but we found an interesting trend going on, because if you remember from the previous slide, the nitrogen input is actually lower in the case of the ecoinvent database, but still the ecoinvent dataset will have slightly higher ammonia emissions to air. We'll explain this in a minute. We can also see a very dramatic effect going on the below graph of the left, in which we are comparing the nitrate emissions to water. Again, nitrate emissions are directly related to the nitrogen input, but even if the ecoinvent database is accounting for lower nitrogen emissions, the lower nitrogen input, sorry for that, the nitrate emissions are actually higher. And then we can see that in the case of the phosphate and the phosphorus, well, Agrifootprint isn't calculating the phosphorus-based emissions to water in the form of phosphate, but rather of phosphorus, and that's why it is empty at the top right graph, but it is showing a particularly high value at the bottom of the right graph. But we can see that, well, the ecoinvent database is actually accounting or calculating both phosphate and phosphorus emissions, and that will cause a difference over at the results, which we'll see in the next slide, please. So as our results, at first, from the 6 impact categories that we defined, we will going to focus. Next, please. We notice that the main difference between the impacts for the Argentinian soybean over these 3 impact categories isn't lying at the direct field emissions, but rather at some other data sets that are also considered by these databases that we won't focus right now. But then if we go to the next graphs, we have 3 impact categories for which we actually identified that direct field emissions are being one of the main drivers for the difference. And these impact categories are terrestrial acidification, marine eutrophication, and water consumption. We can see that, well, having this set of 6 impact categories, that the ecoinvent Argentinian soybean tends to have higher impacts than the Agrifootprint one. Again, this comparison isn't considering any uncertainty over the models, and we see this trade-off on the Agrifootprint soybean actually accounting for higher water consumption impacts. If we move to the next slide, we'll see some contribution analysis. Yeah, thank you. contribution analysis for which we are comparing for each impact category both systems, but classifying the main stages. And the main stage, or where I would like you to focus right now, is at the bottom of each graph, this darker blue contribution, which is actually the direct field emissions that I was talking to you a couple of slides ago. And on this, we can see that even if the terrestrial acidification big difference is mostly caused by land use change and some other things that are going on, the emissions from the direct field emissions stage alone and the terrestrial acidification, the first graph at the left, are actually higher than almost the totality of the Agrifootprint's impacts on soybean production. And what is causing this difference? Well, if we move to the next slide, we'll see that ammonia emissions. So we noticed that there was this difference on the ecoinvent data sets showing higher ammonia emissions, but also we noticed that there is this effect on the regionalization. What's happening here? ecoinvent is modeling the ammonia emissions as default ammonia emissions, but Agrifootprint is giving those same ammonia emissions a regionalization factor based on Argentina. And as a result, the characterization factors will be different. The default ecoinvent characterization factors for the terrestrial acidification potential of ammonia are actually higher than those of the Agrifootprint. So that big difference that we see is the cumulative result of both a higher emission of ammonia and this regionalization factor. Moving to the next one on the marine eutrophication, the difference alone is explained by the nitrate emissions, which we saw on the previous slide that are almost particularly higher for the ecoinvent dataset when compared to the Agrifootprint one. And finally, on the water consumption end, the main driver for these impacts is mostly the water consumption for irrigation. And this also gives us a glimpse of the differences that each database will have on the data sources they are using for modeling, but also on the specific values that they are using. Because in this case, the Agrifootprint dataset is considering that the water consumption is done as directly extracted from nature without any further pumping or some other processes from the technosphere. Then moving to the next slide, we did the same type of comparison for the coconut from the Philippines. Because of the time, I won't get into as much detail as we did for the Argentinian soybean, but I just want you to notice that when we are comparing the synthetic fertilizer inputs, the differences are dramatic. So we have 17 times higher nitrogen inputs in the case of the ecoinvent datasets. We are accounting for an additional phosphorus input, which isn't being considered by the Agrifootprint dataset, and also 9 times higher potassium inputs. What will be the effect of this? If we move to the next slide, we'll see that comparing the impact categories of comparing the two coconut systems, the one from Agrifootprint and the one from ecoinvent, again, we are noticing the same trend in which the ecoinvent dataset is showing higher impacts. But then moving to the next slide, we'll see that the main driver for this difference over the direct field emissions isn't just the specific formulas and methods for calculating these emissions, but also the considerable disparity or difference, if you will, between the synthetic fertilizers inputs. So moving to the next one. So just to conclude, we found considerable differences between databases with this main trend for higher impacts for the ecoinvent datasets in most impact categories. We identified that the underlying methodological choices from each database will have a considerable effect on the impacts, especially on those impact categories related to eutrophication, because, well, we identified that both databases use different calculation methods for the nitrate and phosphorus-based emissions to water, and that there will be a factor on whether some of these flows are actually being modeled on a more specifically regionalized approach, which some, and we don't have much time to get into this, but some impact assessment methods consider those regionalized emissions to have the same characterization factors as the default, but some other ones, like in this case, the recipe 2016 midpoint, will indeed have this consideration. So we can conclude that mixing datasets from different databases must be minimized or done very carefully if necessary, and that future LCA studies must be mindful of keeping consistent calculations and comparisons. And so just to close this presentation, as the one, going back to the introduction, as this main question that every LCA practitioner have asked themselves when starting one LCA project, which dataset should I use? Well, as you can all be familiarized within the whole LCA world, it will depend. It will depend on the specific goal and scope of the project and the way that the systems and the upstream processes have been previously defined. So we can move. The next ones are the references and some acknowledgements for this. So thank you very much for your time. And then we can move to the questions phase of this webinar with my other two colleagues. So I have a question from the audience to Cesar. And what aspects of the consumer electronics are considered on this study, and how are they relating to software?
Okay. For consumer electronics, remember that we have two different ways to address environmental impacts of software. In this case, the supply funnel, depending on data centers, and the demand funnel, depending on consumer electronics of the user. So for that consumer electronics, the main thing to consider is the electricity used by the equipment. And this depends on the components of the computer, the amount of resources used, like the memories, the hard disk drives, the battery. So there is a lot of things to measure the consumption of electricity. And usually we see in electronic projects that the top contributor will be the electricity consumption, depending on the functional unit. In this case, we are focusing on the reduction of time of that computer operating to calculate some LCA model, for example. That's the thing that we address around the end user device. Thank you.
Okay, I see one for Joel. How do the differences in field emission calculation no, it is I'm sorry, Joel, I messed it up. You were gonna, it was a question for me now, right? But can I finish with the one that I found for you?
Sure. It's okay. We have plenty of time for all the questions.
So the question is, how do the differences in field emission calculation methods between ecoinvent and Agrifootprint impact the reliability of the results for agricultural products?
Well, that's a great question. And first of all, we must acknowledge that these two different databases are both valid and both scientifically sound and reliable. So the difference that each database will have on how to account or to calculate their upstream or direct emissions are still based on sound science and sound methods. So isn't as we must be very careful to not conclude that maybe one database is more trustworthy than the other, but rather than these are all models, and we just need to make sure that the internal consistency of the models that we will put together based on the background data that we are using is consistent and sound enough. And this is not just for the agricultural sector, but for all of those. We are aware that there are some also different considerations depending on each database, but it doesn't mean that they are one is better than the other, but they are all trustworthy. We just have to be very careful on which rules are we using, and to keep the consistency throughout the whole LCA. So thank you very much for that question.
Great. And And I have other questions for Mariana from the audience. The first one, Mariana, how does fertilizer and pesticide use change with the MILPA technique?
In the specific case we analyzed, if I'm not mistaken, the amount of nitrogen used was not so different. There was a little bit difference in the amount of inputs for fertilizers used. And we didn't get into the pesticides because there was no information on it. In reality, yes, pesticide use is reduced in herbicides as well. So for example, the glyphosate that is very common to be used in monoculture systems, it's not necessary in the MILPA system. Because of the polyculture, you embrace all the diversity of plants, even if they're not edible, because they are participating in the resilience of the whole system. So it requires more manual work, and in many cases, less inputs that come from outside the system. That's why it's a little bit hard to come up with this is a number for the MILPA, because there are many different ways of growing it. Yeah, I hope that answers the question.
Great. And we have other questions for you, Mariana. There are 3 questions from Ricardo for the audience. Those are the questions. What explains the high relative impact of MILPA in mineral resource scarcity? Have you considered including the specific impacts of glyphosate on irrigated GMO corn? And the last one, are there already LCA studies on the effects of GMO corn in Mexico? Those are the 2 questions.
The first one related to the mineral resource category. It has to do with the fertilizer input. That category is more related to the potassium inputs into the system. I think they were a little bit higher for the reference we had for the MILPA, and that may be the reason. In percentages, the difference in percentages seems large, but the magnitude of the result is not that important, I would say. But yeah, that's the first one. In regard to the second one was about glyphosate. Can you repeat it, Cesar, please?
Yes. The second one is, have you considered including the specific impacts of glyphosate used on irrigated GMO corn?
So yes, glyphosate is included as part of the conventional way of producing corn as in the data set because it's quite used. I haven't gone deep into seeing about the characterization factors. And the last question related to if we have studies about that. In regard to LCA, not that I know about, not that I am aware of it. We're not focusing so much on the study of the pesticide. There's a lot going on in media about the impacts to health. So yeah, it's a very good topic to point out. Thank you.
So we have one question for Cesar. What assumptions are you making regarding both user scenarios, and how much do you think this serverless performance will vary? Well, because each system will be very different.
Okay. This is a very interesting question because the assumptions in the end user device are difficult to make. The first thing is we are assuming that in both cases, we have the same characteristics of the end user device. We have the same laptop with the same resources, with the same memory, the same storage space. From that, the thing that we are analyzing, or the variation in the system that we're analyzing, is the software itself. How the software change the time in that the end user device needs to operate the software as a service, in this case, the matter PD calculation. So this difference in time means difference in resource usage. So in this case, it's not that the end user device will change in different scenarios, but the thing that will change is the time that the user operate the software. And that is because of software design decisions, that this software can operate in different ways. So that is probably the main difference. And with serverless, that means that when you are not using the software as a service system, then the server is not operating, for example, the virtual server. It's operating the storage space, because you already do some calculations, and then you save some space in the server, but it's not that you need to operate or to have the switch on the server all the time. So it's not about the end user device itself, it's about how software uses the resources from that device for the operation of matter PD in this case. I hope that I can respond to the question.
Well, there is another question here for you. Thank you for your presentation. They would like to ask you about the importance of national inventories efforts as a strategy to better gather data related to life cycle inventory made in the countries. Like in the US, we have LCA Commons or SICV in Brazil.
Thank you. Yeah, I totally agree. I think that those national inventories and repositories of LCA data will be very important for making sure that we are all understanding the same thing when running some agricultural systems modeling, and also when replicating or doing some modifications on some other that have been previously created. On that, I think that the key value will be the transparency, because if you put together this LCA model on certain agricultural crop, if you are 100% transparent on the type of the key parameters that you are using for your model and the methods that you used for calculating those field emissions, it will greatly improve the compatibility, if you will, of your study. And there are also some noteworthy initiatives that are happening. There is this ICB calculator that Embrapa has been developing over in Brazil, in which you can put within the Excel spreadsheet or a web page the parameters of your agricultural system, and then you only need to choose on which data set are you calculating your emissions, whether Agrifootprint, AgriBalise, ecoinvent, IPCC, etc., and it will give you the calculation of the results. So those type of initiatives are great for maintaining this steady development of the LCA on agricultural systems. Thank you.
I think there was I saw another question for me, but I answered it. Feel free to email me if you need more information, want more information, but just for the sake of time, I wrote the response.
All right. Well, thank you, César, Mariana, and Joel for your presentations. And thank you to everyone for joining us today. A recording of today's webinar will be posted on our website, earthshiftglobal.com, so stay tuned for that. And we also encourage everyone to subscribe to our e-newsletter, The Shift, to stay up to date on our upcoming webinars and training courses. All right, thank you again, everyone, for your time, and I hope you have a great rest of your day.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.